The fire rose from the old cabin. An elderly woman with silver hair was struck and dragged to the floor. A cold voice shouted, "Sign it, or lose everything!" The door burst open, headlights slicing through the snow. A man stepped in, 55, wearing a weathered army jacket. Beside him, an old canine dog, soaked and trembling, teeth clenched tight. No one spoke. Only the sound of metal, and the storm changed direction. They called him Raymond Cole, a veteran who once brought medals home for his country. Back then, he fought for freedom. Tonight, he fights to protect his mother's home. In a world where money can buy justice, he, Victor Crane, thought one veteran and one dog could never stand against an empire. But he forgot one thing. A soldier never forgets his oath, and a loyal dog never gives up. This story isn't just about a house. It's about faith, loyalty, and how light finds its way back through the storm. Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe. And truly, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Leave your country's name in the comments below. It warms my heart to see how far these stories travel. The first snow of the year came too soon, sweeping down the slopes of Montana like a silent army. It moved through the valleys with the patience of something ancient, filling the air with a muffled stillness that felt almost sacred. Wind coiled around the pines, pressing against the walls of an old cabin where a single candle burned beside the hearth. Inside, the faint crackle of wood was the only sound left standing against the storm. The smell of pine sap and smoke lingered in the room, a small defiance against winter's endless appetite. Margaret Cole sat in a rocking chair that had belonged to her husband, her frail hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. She was 74, with silver hair pinned loosely at her nape and a wool shawl slipping from one shoulder. Her eyes, the color of thawing ice, moved between the firelight and the window pane fogged by her breath. She had lived on this land since the day she was born. Her father, and his father before him, had carved a life here from the dust and the cold. To her, every tree carried a story, every gust of wind an echo of someone's laughter long gone. Outside, the blizzard thickened, but she did not stir. The storm, she thought, was no stranger. The kettle hissed softly, and she rose to pour another cup of tea, her knees trembling beneath the weight of years and memory. The cabin creaked around her, an old friend sighing in the wind. Then came the sound that didn't belong, the distant hum of an engine, growing louder, slicing through the howl of snow. Her heart fluttered. Raymond. Her boy had promised to return before Christmas, and though he never called ahead, she always knew when he was near. The headlights appeared first, flickering through the curtain of white. She smiled faintly, one hand pressed to her chest. But as the truck door slammed shut, the sound was wrong. Too many footsteps, too heavy, too careless. Margaret's smile faded. The door rattled under a sudden knock, not a polite one. It came again, harder. Then a voice, muffled but cold. "Mrs. Cole?" The door opened before she could answer. 3 men stepped in, dragging the storm in with them. Snow fell from their coats in clumps, melting onto the worn floorboards. The tallest, broad-shouldered, early 40s, clean-shaven with eyes sharp as broken glass, surveyed the room. His name was Cal Denton, foreman to a man whose name traveled on whispers and lawsuits. Victor Crane, the developer who had bought half the county under false smiles and forged promises. Margaret straightened her back, the mug still in her hand. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. The man didn't reply. He laid a paper on the table, a contract folded neatly in thirds. Behind him, the others, a red-haired brute with fists like shovels and a younger man whose eyes darted around the cabin as if memorizing the furniture, lingered near the door. "We came with an offer," Cal said, his tone flat as steel. "Mr. Crane's been generous. He's willing to pay cash." Margaret looked at the paper without touching it. Her lips thinned. "This land's not for sale." A silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Outside, the storm beat harder against the windows, like a warning. Cal exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. "You're alone here, ma'am. Would be a shame if—" He didn't finish. The old woman's hand trembled, but she stood taller. "This house has seen worse men than you," she said softly. "And it's still standing." The red-haired man stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. The younger one hesitated, glancing toward the window. Then, in one motion too quick for her to brace, Cal shoved Margaret against the wall. The mug shattered on the floor, the sound sharp and final. She gasped, clutching her chest, her eyes wide with both fear and disbelief. And then, from somewhere deep in the night, came a growl. Low, distant, but unmistakable. The men froze. Another sound followed, the rumble of an engine climbing through snow, closer, heavier. Headlights cut across the room through the window pane, scattering golden shards of light across the walls. The men turned toward the door just as it burst open. The figure in the doorway was carved from the cold itself, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a military jacket scuffed from years of use. His breath rose like smoke. His eyes, gray and steady, swept over the room in silence. Raymond Cole, 55, a veteran whose life had been divided between war zones abroad and the quiet ghosts at home. Snow clung to his hair, melting slowly down the lines of his face. Beside him stood Max, a German shepherd past his prime but not his purpose. Sable black fur streaked with white around the muzzle, eyes bright with instinct. His breath came in short bursts, fogging the air. When he saw Margaret crumpled near the wall, he lowered his head, growling deep enough to make the windows hum. Raymond said nothing. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes carried everything: fury, disbelief, and the kind of controlled calm that came only from years of holding violence on a leash. The wind pushed through the doorway, snuffing out the candle on the table. The room flickered between shadow and light, faces twisting like reflections on broken glass. The younger thug took a step back. We didn't mean," he stammered, but his voice cracked. Cal raised a hand, trying to steady himself. "Mr. Cole," he began, forcing a thin smile. "We're just here to make a deal." Raymond moved forward, slow and deliberate. Max followed, every muscle tense. Snowflakes caught on their shoulders, glinting under the firelight like embers. Raymond's boots creaked on the wooden floor. One step, then another. His mother's breathing came shallow behind him. No one spoke. The storm outside seemed to hold its own breath. Cal's men shifted uneasily, glancing at each other. The red-haired brute reached toward his coat pocket, but before his hand found what it searched for, Max let out a bark that shook the room. The man froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Only the sound of the wind moaning through the cracks of the cabin filled the space between heartbeats. The fire guttered low, the room cast in a trembling orange glow. Raymond's shadow stretched across the wall, merging with Max's, and man and dog forming a single dark silhouette. Then, the faint glint of metal, a hammer being cocked back. The air thickened. Raymond's hand twitched once, a silent warning. Cal's mouth tightened, but the defiance drained from his eyes. One by one, the intruders began to retreat, their boots dragging through the snow, until only the echo of their departure remained. Raymond didn't watch them go. He turned to his mother instead, kneeling beside her. She was trembling, her breath uneven but alive. He brushed a lock of silver hair from her face, his rough hand gentle. She looked up at him through tears. No words passed between them. The firelight painted their faces gold, and for a moment, the war outside, the one made of greed and land and power, felt far away. Outside, the storm screamed through the valley, carrying with it the remnants of smoke and fear. Inside, the candle flickered back to life, its flame small but steady. Raymond stood, his back to the door, eyes scanning the night beyond the window. Max lay near the threshold, his ears perked, his gaze fixed on the darkness. He could still hear the fading hum of an engine somewhere down the ridge. Snow continued to fall, heavy and soundless, burying the tracks of the men who had come and fled. But something in the air had shifted. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. As the last log cracked in the fireplace, a single spark floated up into the dark, dancing briefly before fading into ash. Max's shadow rose, his teeth catching the firelight, his body tensing once more as the wind howled through the open doorway. And then, just like that, everything went black. Morning came pale and merciless, washing the hills of Montana in a light that exposed everything the night had tried to hide. The snow no longer looked soft. It was cold glass now, brittle and sharp where the wind had cut it. Smoke still hung over the cabin like a faded bruise against the sky. The storm had passed, but its silence lingered like a warning, thick and heavy in the air. Inside, Raymond Cole moved slowly through the wreckage, his boots crunching over shattered wood and spilled ash. The table was overturned, the old clock on the wall cracked open like a wound. Near the hearth, his mother sat wrapped in a wool blanket, her face pale but alive. She watched her son as he cleaned her cuts with quiet care, his hands steady even as his eyes burned with something unspoken. The faint morning light touched his weathered features, the scar above his brow, the deep lines carved by both time and war. Once those hands had held a rifle. Now they trembled only when he let them rest. He said nothing. The sound of the wind through the cracks spoke for him. Margaret reached for his sleeve, her fingers cold and light. He didn't look up, but she saw the tightness in his jaw, the old instinct of a soldier restraining the fight that still lived in his bones. There was no peace for men like him, only pauses between battles, and even those never lasted long. Max lingered by the doorway, his fur still damp, pacing with slow, deliberate steps. Every few seconds, his ears flicked toward the woods. He could smell the remnants of strangers, the gun oil, the cheap tobacco, the sweat of fear left behind in footprints now buried under snow. His body stayed taut, but his eyes flicked toward Raymond occasionally, waiting for command, as if unsure whether the war had ended or only changed shape. By noon, Raymond stepped outside. The air was colder, thinner, the kind that bit deep into the lungs. The world was white and endless, the cabin a lone scar against it. He looked over the fence line, where tire tracks wound away toward the trees, half covered by drifting snow. The land stretched beyond them, hills and frozen rivers, the earth his father once called honest ground. But now even the land seemed uneasy, as if holding its breath. Down in the valley, news traveled faster than the wind. The locals at Marvin's Diner, A small place with faded red stools and the smell of burnt coffee were already whispering. "Crane's at it again," someone muttered, stirring sugar into his cup. "He's buying every acre from here to the ridge." Another voice, lower, replied, "Says it's for some eco-resort. But you and I both know what's under those hills ain't for tourists." Victor Crane had become a name people said with their eyes more than their mouths. A man with pressed suits, clean shoes, and no conscience. He arrived in town last spring with a smile wide enough to hide his intentions, promising jobs, renewal, progress. But progress for men like him meant digging out the bones of the earth, selling what belonged to no one. Beneath the ridges lay veins of lithium, shimmering like trapped lightning, the kind of treasure that could turn a valley into a battleground. That evening, Raymond hitched the fence near the edge of the property, his gloves stiff with cold. The sky was the color of steel, the last light of day draining fast. Max trotted beside him, nose low, breath visible in the fading glow. The snow squeaked beneath their boots and paws, the world so quiet that every sound felt magnified. The groan of the trees, the distant snap of ice shifting in the creek. Something metallic caught Raymond's eye near the corner post, a patch of disturbed snow, too square to be natural. He crouched, brushing it aside. Beneath the frost, a small black object glimmered, a box no larger than a fist, half buried in the frozen dirt. He pulled it free and wiped it clean. A lens stared back at him, small, circular, red light blinking faintly. He turned it in his hand. The casing was smooth, unmarked, but the craftsmanship was expensive, deliberate. A hidden camera, one meant for surveillance, not security. Someone had planted it facing the house. He looked up, scanning the tree line, the stillness suddenly hostile. The cold felt heavier now, pressing against his chest. Inside, the fire had burned low. Margaret slept in her chair, a half-finished scarf resting in her lap. The orange light of the embers painted her face in soft shadows. Raymond set the device on the table, next to the broken pieces of the mug he hadn't yet swept away. He watched the faint red blink of the camera as if it were a heartbeat. Steady, mechanical, and wrong. He didn't tell his mother what he'd found. There was no sense in giving her another worry to cradle. Instead, he sat by the fire and stared at the window. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, each flake catching the last reflection of daylight before fading into white. Max lay near the door, eyes half open, ears twitching at every distant crack or rustle. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythm of the wind against the glass. But as midnight drew close, something changed. A sound too deliberate to be nature. A faint hum. A vibration in the distance, like an engine left idling beneath the trees. Max's head lifted immediately, his body rigid. The fur along his back rose like a tide. Raymond stood, slow but ready. He stepped toward the door, hand brushing against the cold metal of his old revolver that hung on a hook. He didn't draw it. Not yet. He opened the door just enough to let the night air in. It hit him in the face like a slap. Bitter, dry, alive. He looked toward the fence line, but there was nothing. Just the snow, the wind, the whisper of trees. Then he saw it, faint, far across the field. A pinprick of light blinking back through the branches. Once. Twice. Max growled low in his throat, the kind of sound that made the night itself hesitate. Raymond squinted, his breath clouding the air. The light blinked again, rhythm steady, almost deliberate. as if answering the red pulse of the camera still lying on the table behind him. He whispered, almost to himself, "We're not alone." The wind carried his words away, and the valley swallowed them whole. The morning rose gray and uncertain, the kind of light that hides more than it reveals. Snow had frozen into a thin crust over the wreckage, crackling softly underfoot as Raymond stepped outside. The valley still slept beneath its blanket of cold, unaware of the quiet war beginning to take root within it. Max followed close, his breath a white cloud in the dawn, his body tense at every unseen sound. Somewhere beyond the fence line, a crow called once, then fell silent, a note that hung in the air like a bad omen. The sound of tires crunching through snow drew Raymond's gaze toward the road. A sheriff's truck pulled up slowly, its blue paint dulled by dust and years of winter salt. When the door opened, Sheriff Tom Danner stepped out. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered but slower now, the weight of time and compromise etched deep into his face. His once black hair had turned mostly gray, his eyes still sharp but dimmed by something heavier than age. He and Raymond had once worn the same uniform, fought on the same ground, shared the same belief that justice was a matter of courage. But that was another lifetime, before medals started rusting in drawers, and good men learned to stay quiet to survive. Tom stood before the cabin, his gloved hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His gaze drifted over the damage, the broken door, the scorched wood, the shards of glass glinting in the snow. For a long while, neither man spoke. Raymond only watched, waiting for the question that never came. When Tom finally did speak, his voice was low, roughened by cold and guilt. "You drove them off." It wasn't disbelief. It was resignation. Raymond nodded once. Tom gave a faint, humorless smile. "Guess you still know how to end a fight." There was more he wanted to say. Apologies, maybe warnings. But the words froze before they reached his mouth. Instead, he tipped his hat and walked the perimeter of the cabin, his boots leaving deliberate prints in the snow. His eyes paused on the fence line, then on the black box still half hidden beneath ice. A flicker of recognition passed through his expression, gone almost as soon as it came. When he left, he said only, "You watch yourself, Ray." Then the truck rolled away, leaving the sound of its engine echoing through the pines like a memory that refused to fade. That afternoon, Raymond drove into town. The world outside his windshield was a blur of white and shadow, familiar roads that somehow felt foreign now. He carried the small surveillance camera wrapped in an old handkerchief, tucked inside his jacket. The streets of Millhaven were quiet. A grocery store, a post office, the diner where whispers grew legs. He parked outside the Herald office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of ink and dust, and stepped inside. That's where he met Lena Ward. She was in her 30s, tall and lean, her dark hair tied back, her eyes the color of storm glass, always watching, always measuring. A reporter by trade, but her demeanor was that of someone who had learned that truth rarely rewarded those who chased it. Her office was cluttered with yellowed files, old maps, and a coffee mug chipped along the rim. When Raymond placed the black box on her desk, she leaned closer, the reflection of its tiny red lens glinting in her eyes. "Someone's watching you," she murmured. "Or maybe they're watching what you're standing on." Together, they began digging. Lena pulled out property records from dusty cabinets, while Raymond sat beside her, his fingers tracing over the faded ink of old deeds. The names repeated across every page: Crane Industries, Westview Holdings, Silver Pine Resorts. Different titles, same signature, Permits stamped by officials who no longer worked in the county. Licenses issued to companies that didn't exist. Every document pointed back to the same man. Victor Crane, the one who smiled for cameras but built empires on fear. Hours passed unnoticed. The daylight dimmed, and the yellow lamp on Lena's desk became the only thing holding back the evening. She paused, looking at Raymond, at the rigid way he held himself, at the shadow that never left his face. "You could leave," she said softly. "Sell. Start over somewhere else." He didn't answer. The lines around his mouth deepened, his silence speaking louder than any refusal could. Some people stayed not because they had hope, but because leaving meant surrender. By the time he returned home, the sky had turned the color of dying embers. Margaret had gone to bed early, the old barn lamp still glowing through the frost-blurred window. The world felt too still, like the air before a shot. Raymond hung his coat by the door, rubbed the frost from his hands, and sat for a moment beside Max, who rested near the fire, but never truly relaxed. Then it came, the sudden crack of wood outside, a sound too violent to be the wind. Raymond sprang up, heart pounding. Through the window, an orange glow bled into the snow, small at first, then rising fast. Flames. The old barn was on fire. He ran into the night, snow biting his face, breath tearing at his lungs. "Mom!" he shouted, though he already knew she was safe inside. The fire roared like an animal set free, swallowing the dry timber in waves of gold and black. Sparks leapt into the wind, carried away like fleeting souls. Raymond grabbed a shovel, tried to break through the barn doors, but the heat was too much, too wild. Then Max bolted. The leash slipped from Raymond's hand before he could stop him. The dog lunged through the smoke, disappearing into the inferno. "Max!" The name tore from his throat, lost to the roar of burning wood. For a moment, there was nothing, only the sound of the barn collapsing in on itself. Then, through the haze, a shape emerged. Max staggered out, muzzle blackened, carrying something clutched in his teeth. So it's a half-burnt crate, small enough for one man to carry, heavy enough to mean trouble. Raymond rushed forward, pulling it away from the dog and kicking snow over the smoldering edges. Inside, wrapped in charred cloth and ash, were maps. Hand-drawn lines of the valley, dotted with markers and codes. Beneath them, a bundle of survey reports, stamped with the logo of Cranes Corporation. He turned one page, and there it was. Mineral charts, extraction plans, proposed access roads. Crane hadn't been negotiating for the land. He'd already claimed it, mapped it, and marked the veins like a hunter counting trophies. The resort was a lie. The valley itself was the prize. Raymond knelt in the snow, the papers spread before him, the firelight flickering across his face. Max lay beside him, chest rising in shallow breaths, eyes still alert despite exhaustion. For a long while they stayed there, man and dog, framed by the glow of something that was once a barn, and now only truth burning its way into light. When the last flame died, the silence returned. Smoke drifted into the sky, carrying the smell of pine and ruin. Raymond brushed ash from Max's fur, whispering something too soft for the night to hear. Then Max stirred, nose twitching. He pawed at the ground near the blackened remains, digging clumsily until metal glinted beneath the soot. Raymond reached down and lifted it. It was a badge, warped by heat, edges charred, but still readable. Sheriff. The snow fell harder now, covering the evidence like it was trying to hide the truth. But some things, once unearthed, refused to stay buried. The morning began with a sound that didn't belong, the long groan of wood surrendering under snow. The roof of the old shed caved in, sending a hush through the cold air so heavy it felt like grief taking form. Raymond looked up from the porch, hammer still in his hand, as the timbers split open under the weight of white. It was as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath too long. Max lifted his head beside him, ears twitching, eyes following the slow fall of dust and snowflakes like it meant something more. And maybe it did, because when the roof gave way, so did trust. By noon, word had spread through the frozen valley, though no one spoke it aloud. The sheriff, the man Raymond had once called brother, had sold his oath for Crane's money. It came not as a rumor, but as proof. A stamped signature, an authorization code, a string of transactions that Lena had traced like a trail of ash. She had shown them to Raymond the night before, her hands trembling, her voice breaking the silence only to whisper, "He's been on their payroll for months." Raymond didn't speak. He didn't curse or break anything. He just stared at the fire until the embers dimmed, his face caught somewhere between rage and disbelief. Now, as dawn thinned into daylight, the truth sat between them like a shadow that wouldn't move. Outside, faint mechanical whirs broke through the wind. Small shapes glided over the ridge, surveillance drones, black against the pale sky, circling like vultures that knew what they were waiting for. Margaret watched them from the window, her hand pressed to the glass, the reflection of the machines floating in her tired eyes. "It's starting again," she murmured. Raymond placed a hand on her shoulder. He wanted to tell her it would be fine, that he'd seen worse storms. But the lie wouldn't leave his mouth. Just after midday, something slid under the cabin door. A folded note, clean paper against dirty floorboards. Max was the first to notice. His low growl filled the quiet like thunder still trapped behind the clouds. Raymond bent down and opened it. 3 words, handwritten in neat, deliberate strokes. "Sell now, before it burns again." He stared at the paper for a long time, his jaw tightening, thumb brushing over the ink as if trying to erase it. Margaret sank into her chair by the fire, tears brimming though she tried to hide them. "Please, Ray," she said softly. "Let's leave before they take everything." He shook his head. "They already have, Ma. Everything but this." He looked out the window, at the frozen hills, the old trees still bearing the scars of past winters. "Your father bled into this soil," she whispered. "You don't owe it anything." But he did. In his mind, he could still see the folded flag that once lay across his chest, the one he'd carried home after 20 years of wars that never ended inside him. He owed it not just to land, but to memory. To all the things that made him still believe honor could outlast greed. That evening, Lena returned. Her truck rolled up slow, headlights dim against the mist. Her face pale from the cold, but eyes sharp with purpose. She carried a small notebook and a folded piece of the map they'd found in the burned crate. The paper had been half scorched, but the numbers, coordinates, were clear enough to follow. "If Crane's after minerals," she said, unfolding it on the hood of the truck, "this is where he'll dig. It's not just lithium. There's water beneath the ridge, an aquifer." They drove out before dusk, following the map through a narrow trail that wound between snow-clad pines. The light faded fast, turning the world to shades of gray and blue. Max rode in the back, his breath fogging the window, his reflection merging with the forest beyond. The ridge rose ahead, sharp and solemn, its cliffs jagged against the falling sky. When they reached the top, the wind hit them like a wave, dry, fierce, unrelenting. It carried the smell of metal and something older, something that felt alive beneath the ground. They walked the ridge in silence. The snow crunched beneath their boots. Their breath came out in clouds. Raymond knelt near a fissure in the rock where the wind hissed softly through a crack. He brushed away the frost, revealing faint traces of drilling, recent, deliberate. Lena crouched beside him, pulling out a small field light. When she turned it on, the beam cut through the gloom and reflected something deep within the stone. A shimmer, faintly green, like veins of glass beneath the earth. "That's it," she whispered. "Crane's fortune, and your father's grave." Raymond ran a gloved hand along the rock, feeling the cold hum beneath it. It was more than metal. It was life itself, trapped and waiting. "He'll tear this valley apart for it," Lena said. Raymond nodded. "Not if I stand first." His voice was low, steady, the tone of a man who'd already made peace with what resistance might cost. The sun had long disappeared when they returned. The sky hung heavy with unfallen snow, the kind that made the world hold its breath. Margaret stood on the porch, a lantern glowing in her hand, waiting, always waiting. Raymond's truck stopped by the fence. Max jumped down first, pawing at the path, restless. Lena followed, gathering her notes. And then, in that fragile moment of stillness, the sound came. A single shot. It cracked through the cold like lightning splitting the air. Raymond froze. The echo rolled across the valley, bouncing between ridges, and then silence. The lantern shattered against the wood of the porch, its flame hissing into the snow. Margaret stumbled, gripping the railing as the light went out. Raymond's eyes snapped toward the tree line. Smoke drifted faintly in the distance, too far to see, too near to ignore. Max's head jerked up, nose flaring, muscles coiled like wire. For one heartbeat, everything stood still. The wind, the snow, even breath. Then Max lunged forward, a blur of brown and black against the white. He tore through the drifts, following the invisible trail of gunpowder and betrayal. Raymond called his name once, but the sound was swallowed by the dark. The snow fell harder, muffling the world until only echoes remained. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the frozen trees, the dog's silhouette vanished, swallowed whole by the night that no longer knew mercy. The dawn came cold and colorless, like the breath of something that no longer believed in warmth. Raymond sat by the table, the air thick with the scent of smoke and pine. The ashes from the night before still clung to his boots, fine gray dust marking where the barn had once stood. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of his mother's old clock, a sound that seemed to keep time not with seconds, but with memories. On the table lay what Max had dragged from the ruins, the sheriff's badge, and beside it, a small black device no bigger than a matchbox. Its metal surface was scorched, but the light on its side still blinked weakly, like a dying heart refusing to stop. He turned it over once, twice, unsure of what it was, until he pressed a small recessed button. Static filled the air, a broken whisper of sound, crackling through the quiet. Then, a voice. Smooth, cold, familiar. "Make it look like an accident. No one will question a fire in the mountains." Raymond froze. The name came to him before the recording finished. Victor Crane. The tone was unmistakable. Steady, unhurried, the kind of voice used to giving orders without fear of consequence. Across the table, Lena's hands clenched into fists. Her jaw tightened, the reflection of the device flickering in her eyes. "He planned it," she whispered. "The sheriff was just following orders." Raymond nodded once, his silence louder than any curse. Outside, Max let out a low growl, pacing by the window as if sensing the weight of what had just been unearthed. The truth was no longer hidden beneath the snow. It was burning in their hands. Lena leaned closer, voice steady despite the tremor in her breath. "We take this public," she said. Raymond looked at her, the lines of exhaustion on her face, the fire that hadn't yet gone out behind her eyes. For the first time in weeks, something inside him flickered too. Not hope, not yet, but purpose. He nodded. "Then let's make them listen." By afternoon, word had already begun to move. Not through whispers, but through wires and screens. Lena's contacts in Denver, journalists, whistleblowers, men and women who still believed the truth had teeth, had taken the footage, cleaned the audio, traced the timestamp. Everything was ready. But for the story to matter, it needed a face. Raymond knew that face wasn't his. It was Crane's. That night, the city glittered like frost under artificial light. The Hilton Grand Ballroom stood draped in banners of white and gold, each one reading Wind River Haven Project, a new future for the West. The irony stung like salt. Inside, the air hummed with chatter, champagne glasses clinking as Denver's elite gathered to applaud the man who had built his empire on lies. Crane stood at the podium, immaculate in a charcoal suit, silver hair combed back, the picture of calm power. Cameras lined the front rows, their lenses blinking like watchful eyes. He smiled that well-rehearsed smile, every gesture polished from years of deception. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate not just progress but possibility, a promise to restore, rebuild, and—" He didn't finish. The big screen behind him flickered once, then again. The logo dissolved into static. The crowd murmured, the sound rising like distant thunder. Then the image cleared, and the ballroom went silent. Grainy footage appeared, the sheriff's badge glinting in firelight, voices overlapping, static, wind, and then Crane's own words, unmistakable. "Make it look like an accident. No one will question a fire in the mountains." The sentence hung in the air, cruel in its simplicity. Crane's eyes widened just slightly before he masked it with a thin smile. "That's enough," he snapped toward the technicians. But the sound system didn't obey him. The footage rolled on, the flames, the smoke, the proof. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in chaos. "Is that your voice, Mr. Crane? Were you involved in the Millhaven fire? Did you pay Sheriff Danner?" The questions crashed like waves, relentless. For the first time, the man who controlled everything stood trapped under his own light. From the back of the hall, a shape moved through the crowd. Raymond. His old army coat hung heavy on his shoulders, the scars of the mountains still on his skin. Max padded beside him, steady, silent, his fur gleaming under the stage lights. Every head turned as the pair approached the podium, not with rage, but with the stillness of something inevitable. Crane's hand twitched near his tie, the only betrayal of nerves. Raymond reached the stage and set something down before him. The sheriff's burned badge blackened and warped. The room fell quiet again, save for the hum of the projectors. For a moment, even the cameras forgot to blink. Raymond's voice carried through the still air, deep and even, with the weight of a man who had seen too many lies dressed as progress. "You built your empire on ashes," he said. Today, the wind returns them to you. His words didn't echo. They landed. Heavy. Final. Crane's face hardened, composure cracking at last. Security began to move, reporters surged again, questions colliding with shouts. But Crane didn't look at them. His gaze stayed locked on Raymond, unflinching, venomous. The police pushed through the crowd, hands on their radios, the first pair of cuffs glinting under the ballroom lights. As they reached the podium, Crane leaned forward slightly, his voice just above a whisper. "You think this ends with me?" The words slipped past the noise like a knife through fabric. Soft, sharp, meant to linger. Raymond didn't answer. He simply stood there as the officers closed in, the crowd erupting once more, half in disbelief, half in vindication. Beside him, Max remained still, his eyes fixed not on Crane, but on the exit, as if sensing that victory and danger sometimes walked the same road. Outside, snow began to fall again over the city, slow and deliberate. The same snow that had buried lies in the mountains now blanketing the concrete and steel. Somewhere far from the flashing cameras, the wind carried the faint sound of a man exhaling, long and tired, like someone who had finally laid down the burden of silence. But under that wind, beneath the calm, another current stirred, the kind that never truly sleeps, whispering that truth has a cost, and the reckoning was only half begun. Spring came shyly to the mountains, as if afraid to touch the ground that had once burned. The snow melted slow, seeping into the soil like a whispered apology. Streams trickled down the ridges, weaving through blackened roots now sprouting green again. The barn stood rebuilt, not as it was, but as it needed to be. Its walls smelled of pine and smoke. Its roof gleamed with the faint sheen of rain. Beneath it, grass grew where ashes once lay, thin at first, then thick and proud, as if life itself had decided it would not lose a second time. Margaret moved through her garden like time learning to walk again. Her back bent, her hands fragile but steady, firm in their quiet defiance. She tended to small sprouts pushing through thawed earth, humming under her breath songs that had outlived grief. The sunlight fell on her silver hair, and in its glow, the years no longer looked heavy. "It's strange," she said once, half to herself, "how something so broken can grow back softer." The wind carried her words away, gentle, as if agreeing. The sheriff's badge rested on the mantel, untouched since that night in Denver. Raymond didn't wear it, didn't polish it, didn't throw it away. He had left it behind, not out of bitterness, but peace. It no longer defined him. The world had already taken and returned enough titles. What mattered now was what he built with his hands, not what anyone else called him for it. Up on the ridge, where the wind was still clean and the trees whispered of old storms, a new sign had been nailed into the earth: the House of Second Chances. Beneath it stood a wide fenced field, soft with new grass. Dogs ran there, strays, rescues, the forgotten and the brave. Some limped, some carried scars, but all moved with the fierce joy of survival. Raymond walked among them every morning, his boots damp with dew, the sky opening above him like forgiveness. Max was always near. Older now, slower in the joints, but still holding that same steady grace. His muzzle had grayed, his movements less swift, yet his eyes remained sharp, warm amber pools that carried years of unspoken stories. He had become the sanctuary's guardian, the quiet proof that loyalty is not bound by youth. The townsfolk often stopped by, leaving food, blankets, or simply standing at the fence just to watch. For them, the sight of that old dog was a kind of prayer that didn't need words. Lena's article came weeks later. It carried a title she hadn't told him about. The Soldier Who Stood His Ground. It spread far beyond the valley, reaching newspapers, radio stations, and online screens across the country. Strangers wrote letters. Veterans sent medals they no longer wore. Somewhere out there, people began to say his name with reverence. But Raymond never read it. The paper lay folded on his workbench, edges curling under the morning light. He spent his mornings walking the fence line, repairing what time and weather tried to undo. His evenings belonged to his mother, the two of them sitting by the porch while the sky blushed into twilight. Sometimes Lena visited, bringing coffee and laughter, and for a few hours, the heaviness of memory felt almost like grace. The world outside still spun, still shouted, but here, between mountain and wind, life had returned to its truest rhythm. One night, as dusk deepened and the air turned cool, Raymond sat on the steps with Max lying at his feet. The lantern burned low, its flame steady and golden. The valley stretched before them, the trees whispering in the dark. Somewhere far off, an owl called, the sound hollow, eternal. Raymond reached down, running a hand through Max's fur. The dog lifted his head, ears tilting toward the horizon. A soft bark left his throat. One, then none, then silence. The wind rose gently through the pines, carrying that single sound across the valley, over rivers and ridges, until it disappeared into the same sky that had once carried smoke. It wasn't a goodbye. It was something else. A promise returned. And in that moment, beneath the endless breath of the mountain, the world felt honest again. Because courage once given doesn't fade with time. It lingers in the soil that remembers, in the hands that rebuild, and in the quiet hearts that keep watch when no one else does. Sometimes, the quiet after a storm says more than the storm ever could. When the fires fade and the snow begins to fall again, what remains isn't the noise of what was lost, but the small, steadfast things that refused to give up. A loyal companion waiting by the door, a hand steadying another through the dark. A promise kept, even when no one is watching. There are people and hearts like that everywhere. They don't ask for recognition or applause. They simply stand where they're needed, holding the line between what breaks and what endures. Their courage isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and deeply human. And maybe that's what the world still runs on. Not grand victories, but the quiet ones. The ones that happen when kindness chooses to stay, even after the world moves on. Not every hero wears a badge, and not every story makes the headlines. Here at Healing with Max, we keep their courage alive. Subscribe today, so you'll never miss the next untold story of veteran and their Max partners.